Welcome to our fourth episode in our study of databases and database users. In this video, we're going to start with a discussion of the phases of designing a database. The design of a new application for an existing database or design for a brand new database starts off with the phase requirements, specification, and analysis. These requirements are documented and detailed and transformed into a conceptual design that can be represented and manipulated using some computerized tools so that it can easily be maintained, modified, and transformed into a database implementation. Later we'll talk about a model called the Entity Relationship Model, or the ER model, that is used for this purpose. The design is then translated into a logical design that can be expressed in a data model implemented in a commercial database management system. The final stage is physical design, during which further specifications are provided for storing and accessing the database. The database design is implemented, populated with actual data, and then continuously maintained to reflect the state of the organization. Earlier in a previous act, we talked about the fact that modern applications, for the most part, are developed using one of these database management systems. So how were applications developed previously? In traditional file processing, which is what we're talking about, each user defines and implements the files needed for a specific software application as part of the programming of the application. Obviously, by user in this instance, I would normally be talking about a programmer developing an application in a high-level language like C or Java or COBOL or something like that. In the earlier days at my own university, a department acquired a computer and hired a programmer to develop some special applications for that department alone. Then, as other departments began to recognize the same need for themselves and found that the organization's computer had the capacity to add more applications and data files, they too hired a programmer to develop their applications. As this evolution continued, it was eventually found that the university had applications independently updating information about the same entities for different departments. In other words, they found, for example, that they had 5 different files maintaining information about students. So what problems would a situation like this present? Obviously, storage space was being wasted by having all that redundant data. It is probably safe to say that not all of the files had current information about any student. For example, let's say that a student marries and has a name change. We can be sure that not all the departments would be aware of the change in the student's name. So the result would be a student being listed by different names in different applications. We would also find that the additional labor would be needed to update all of those redundant files. On the other hand, in the database approach, a single repository maintains data that is defined once and then accessed by various departments and users. In a database, the names and labels of data are defined once and used repeatedly by queries, transactions, and applications. The main characteristic of the database approach versus the file processing approach are the following. The database approach is self-describing, meaning that the applications being created, if they need to access the student file, the structure of the student file is automatically there to help with the creation of the application. And there's an insulation in the database approach between the programs and the data abstraction. In other words, if one modifies the database, that does not affect the programs that are written using that database. At the same time, if one modifies a program, that doesn't affect the database structure, making this a much more reliable approach to creating applications. The database approach supports multiple views of the data, and sharing of data and multi-user transaction processing is much simpler and much more reliable because the database handles the responsibility for much of that. Since we've been talking about the database approach for most of this episode, why don't we make database approach our mystery word this time? So go ahead, step down below here, put in our mystery word. I'm sure you can still remember it. And then go check my knowledge in the coursework section. And when you're ready, come on back and we will go to the next episode of this series.